In the early stage of the Soviet-German War, the German army was unstoppable. It took only half a year to occupy 1.5 million square kilometers of Soviet land, causing more than 3 million casualties to the Soviet army. Even so, the Soviet army defeated the powerful German army in the Battle of Moscow, ending the German army's winning streak in Operation Barbarossa. What exactly caused the German army to be defeated at the gates of Moscow? Some people say it was because of the severe, cold weather, and some people say it was because of the original owners of Britain and the United States. But these reasons are not the most important. The fundamental reason is the German army's strategic and tactical mistakes. First of all, due to the limitations of comprehensive national strength, Germany did not have enough armored forces. For example, in the Battle of France, the German army did not have an advantage in the number and quality of tanks, but because of the proper use of the blitzkrieg idea. After the Battle of France, the German army had a total of 10 armored divisions and 14 motorized infantry divisions. These troops constituted the backbone of the German armored forces and were the pioneers of the German blitzkrieg. In 1941, although the number of German armored divisions increased to 21, the total number of tanks did not increase much. When the German army blitzed and swept across Western Europe, the core force of each armored division was an armored brigade. Each brigade had 2 regiments, and each regiment had about 150 tanks, that is, an armored division had about 300 tanks. Later, Hitler ordered to withdraw an armored regiment from each armored division to form a new armored division. Although the number of armored divisions increased, the number of tanks in each armored division decreased. This led to a decrease in the combat effectiveness and mobility of the armored division. These problems had a fatal impact on the German army after the outbreak of the Soviet-German War. In 1941, a German armored division was equipped with less than 300 tanks and about 3,000 wheeled vehicles. Wheeled vehicles can only travel on roads or relatively flat ground, and the traffic conditions in the Soviet Union were very poor. When the Soviet-German War broke out, the German army had a total of more than 3,500 tanks, while the Soviet army had 23,000, of which about half were deployed in the western part of the Soviet Union. Even so, the German army used tactical advantages and military quality to offset the Soviet army's numerical advantage, and used armored groups to attack the Soviet army again and again. However, it is not difficult to find that in the early stage of Operation Barbarossa, the German army had lost the opportunity to attack the main force of the Soviet army 3 times. During this period, the strategic focus of the German army was in the center. The Central Army Group concentrated the most elite armored forces of the German army at that time, including Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army and Hoth's 3rd Panzer Army, as well as the 4th and 9th Armies. 2 of the armored armies will use forward offensives. The first attack on the main force of the Soviet army occurred in the Slonim area, 100 miles deep in the Soviet Union. At that time, the 2nd and 3rd Panzer Groups had already bypassed and arrived at the rear of the Soviet army, but because the 4th and 9th armies were mainly infantry, they failed to quickly close the encirclement. As a result, half of the 2 heavy Soviet army groups broke through, and the German army could only continue to move eastward to create the next opportunity. Facing the surrounding environment, the German soldiers who had just entered the Soviet Union could not help but sigh that the land here seemed to have no boundaries, with plains, forests, and swamps everywhere, stretching as far as the eye could see. The second encirclement of the Soviet army by the Central Army Group was in Minsk, but a sudden heavy rain made the road muddy, greatly slowing down the German army's advance. In the Battle of Minsk, although the German army completely defeated 320,000 Soviet troops, 300,000 Soviet troops still escaped the encirclement. These Soviet troops quickly joined the Dnieper and the new coastal front. The forests and swamps southeast of Minsk controlled the advance of the German armored forces. When the Germans got rid of these bad terrain conditions, they could no longer catch up with the retreating Soviets. The Germans' plan to annihilate the main force of the Soviets in a short period of time failed again. Next, the Germans launched the Smolensk campaign. They will cross the Minsk Mint, detour to the rear of Smolensk, and use the forward offensive to encircle the Soviet heavy troops here. At this time, the 2nd and 3rd Panzer armies could not advance immediately. The first reason was that they had to eliminate the Soviet troops involved in the Minsk encirclement, and the second was that they had to wait for the 4th and 9th armies to arrive. The 2 infantry armies traveled day and night and caught up with the armored forces in half a month. On July 11th, Guderian's 2 villages broke through the Soviet rooms in Dnieper and arrived near Smolensk on July 16th. However, Hoth's 3 villages on the northern wing encountered heavy rain again, which resulted in the German encirclement not being closed in time. Half of the 600,000 Soviet troops escaped the encirclement. So far, the 3 incomplete and difficult cuts have resulted in the following result. The retreating Soviet troops have built a new line of defense in front of the German army, and newly mobilized troops are also arriving in a steady stream. At this time, the German army is still 200 miles away from Moscow. At this time, Guderian believed that the Central Army Group should continue to advance towards Moscow, driving the Soviet army to run non-stop so that it cannot get a chance to reorganize and breathe. Before the Soviet army has established a solid line of defense, taking Moscow in one fell swoop may end the war on the Eastern Front. However, Hitler changed the strategic plan. He asked the Central Army Group to divide its troops into North and South. Guderian's Erzhwangji went south to support the Southern Army Group to launch the Kiev campaign, and Hoth's Sanzhuangji went north to support the Northern Army Group to attack Leningrad. Although the German army defeated more than 600,000 Soviet troops in the Battle of the Auxiliary Forces, the battle lasted until late September, buying precious time for the Soviet army to strengthen its defense in the direction of Moscow. On September 30th, the Battle of Moscow broke out. The Central Army Group made smooth progress in the early stage. In the Battle of Vyachemovo-Bryansko, the Soviet army suffered another 670,000 casualties. However, this battle lasted until the end of October. The German army was exhausted from continuous fighting. The weather was gradually getting colder, and the Soviet reinforcements were also on their way. There was not much time left for the German army. On November 15th, the German army had advanced to an area 20 miles away from Moscow. On December 2nd, the German army launched its last offensive and some of the German troops had entered the suburbs, but this was already the limit of the German army. The equipment and personnel lost by the German army could not be replenished in time, and the severe cold weather made the German army suffer more, especially the loss of armored forces. At this time, the Soviet army had assembled 1 million troops and launched a large-scale counterattack against the exhausted German army. The German Army Group Center was forced to retreat 200 kilometers and stabilize the front line in the Rzhev area. In the Battle of Moscow, the German army lost 500,000 elite troops, more than 1,300 tanks, and more than 15,000 vehicles. The German army was quickly defeated, the Soviet plan failed, and the Lightning Station was forced to become a consumption station. The Battle of Moscow was the first major victory of the Soviet army after the outbreak of the Soviet-German War, which greatly boosted the morale of the Soviet army. The German army's Operation Barbarossa ended in failure. To sum up, there are 3 reasons for the German army's failure in the Battle of Moscow. The first is that the German army underestimated the Soviet army's salute. When the war broke out, the German General Staff received intelligence that the Soviet army had a total of 200 divisions, but after the war broke out, they found 360 divisions. The vast territory and strong manpower of the Soviet Union made it necessary for the Soviet army to win. The second reason was that the German army made a strategic mistake, splitting its troops at a critical moment and missing the best opportunity to capture Moscow. The third reason was that the transportation conditions in the Soviet Union were poor at the time. Whether it was rainy season or spring, the melting of ice and snow would cause a period of congestion. In addition, the German army lacked tracked vehicles, that is, insufficient armored forces. These reasons ultimately led to the German army's disastrous defeat in the Battle of Moscow.